4:18 p.m. Western Pacific. Open sea. Broad daylight. At that exact moment, U.S. warships stopped advancing. Not because of mechanical failure, not because of weather, but because new signals flooded navigation channels almost simultaneously. Warnings, control notices, restricted movement advisories. Chinese naval forces had repositioned. No missiles were launched, no shots were fired, but the routes ahead were no longer clear. Multiple U.S. vessels suddenly found themselves facing overlapping patrol zones, surveillance ships moving into precise alignment, and air activity intensifying above international waters. It wasn't a blockade in the traditional sense. It was something more calculated, a physical presence designed to slow, contain, and test. Commanders on both sides understood the risk instantly, because when warships stop moving in open sea, the situation is already unstable. And when neither side fires, the pressure shifts elsewhere. At 4:21 p.m., bridge crews monitored radar returns that were growing increasingly dense. Aircraft passed overhead without deviation. Chinese vessels maintained distance, close enough to be undeniable, far enough to avoid escalation. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Every move appeared deliberate, every position intentional. Radio traffic increased, then quieted. Diplomatic channels went live. Emergency lines opened. But on the water, no one moved. At 4:25 p.m., analysts in distant command centers began watching for the real danger. Not missiles, not weapons, but anomalies. Because modern conflict doesn't always begin with explosions. Sometimes it begins with restraint, and restraint only lasts as long as systems keep talking to each other. As the standoff continued, electronic activity surged quietly beneath the surface. Radar sweeps intensified. Signal intelligence operators leaned forward in their chairs. Everyone was watching for the same thing, not an attack, but silence. Because silence meant control had shifted. At 4:18 p.m., ships were blocked. And somewhere between that moment and whatever came next, the Pacific stopped behaving normally. No one said it out loud yet, but everyone could feel it. The clock had started. At 4:26 p.m., the standoff entered a different phase. On the surface, nothing changed. Ships held position. Aircraft maintained altitude. Distances remained carefully measured. But below the visible layer, activity surged. Electronic signals multiplied across the spectrum. Radar sweeps intensified in short, rapid cycles. Navigation systems recalculated routes that no longer existed. This was no longer about ships blocking ships. It was about systems watching systems. Chinese naval units adjusted formations with subtle precision, creating overlapping coverage zones. Surveillance aircraft widened their orbits. Data links pulsed constantly, feeding command centers far from the water. U.S. crews noticed it immediately. Their displays were still live, but crowded. Returns stacked on returns. Noise crept in where clarity used to be. At 4:31 p.m., a senior officer on the bridge of one destroyer made a quiet note. Electronic environment is changing. No one replied. They didn't need to. Because every modern naval confrontation reaches this moment, the point where pressure shifts from physical proximity to information dominance. At 4:34 p.m., satellite tasking requests increased. Cyber monitoring went to heightened alert. Analysts stopped watching the ships and started watching the data streams that connected them. Nothing hostile had occurred, but everything was strained. In Beijing, Washington, and command centers across the region, decision-makers understood the danger. When too many sensors look at each other at once, mistakes don't come from aggression. They come from overload. At 4:38 p.m., small inconsistencies appeared. A track refreshed a fraction of a second late. A data packet repeated itself. A system compensated, then compensated again. Individually, meaningless. Together, concerning. No alarm sounded, no warnings issued. But operators leaned closer to their screens. This was the moment both sides feared most. Because escalation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. When systems hesitate, when data hesitates, when information begins to lag behind reality. By 4:43 p.m., commanders were no longer asking, "Will someone fire?" They were asking something far worse. What happens if the systems stop agreeing with each other? The ships were still blocked. The sky was still clear. But the invisible architecture holding everything together was under strain. And everyone watching knew the next phase wouldn't involve orders shouted across decks. It would involve something simply failing. At 4:49 p.m., the first anomaly appeared. Not on radar screens watched by the public, not on commercial tracking systems. It appeared inside restricted operational feeds. A maritime track failed to refresh. At first, no one reacted. Systems lag all the time. Milliseconds don't matter, until they do. At 4:51 p.m., a second feed stalled, then a third. Positions still existed, but they stopped updating in real time. Ships hadn't vanished, information had. Operators checked redundancies. Secondary systems mirrored the same delay. Backup feeds showed the same hesitation. At 4:54 p.m., command centers stopped speaking aloud because this wasn't a sensor failure, it was systemic. Data was still flowing, just not synchronizing. Some tracks jumped forward, others froze. A few corrected themselves, then drifted again. No alarms triggered, because no single system detected an emergency. But together, they told a different story. At 4:57 p.m., analysts realized the danger. When situational awareness fragments, commanders lose the ability to distinguish intent from error. A ship slowing might look like a maneuver. A course correction might look like defiance. In that environment, misinterpretation becomes lethal. At 5:00 p.m., the Pacific entered what officers later described only as degraded awareness. No official term was used. No report was written, because naming it would have meant admitting something had slipped out of control. During those minutes, both sides reduced visible movement, not out of restraint, out of uncertainty. No one wanted to act based on incomplete data. At 5:04 p.m., one officer quietly asked the question no one wanted to answer. Do we still trust what we're seeing? No response came back, because the answer was no. By 5:08 p.m., the operational zone no longer behaved predictably. Tracking relied on estimation. Confidence eroded with every refresh cycle. The blockade still existed. The ships were still there, but the systems designed to prevent catastrophe were no longer aligned. And that was the most dangerous condition of all. Because when information collapses, decisions don't stop, they accelerate. And somewhere in those missing minutes, something irreversible was already unfolding. NC, not dramatically, but decisively. Multiple operational feeds failed to reconcile. Data that should have aligned no longer matched across systems. Timestamps drifted. Correlations broke. Command centers issued quiet, internal instructions. Do not escalate. Hold current posture. Await clarification. But clarification never came. At 5:11 p.m., an entire section of the operational map went gray. Not blank, not offline, unavailable. No tracking loss alerts were triggered because nothing had technically failed. Systems were still running, sensors were still active. They just weren't agreeing with each other anymore. This was the blackout, not visible to civilians, not visible to commercial systems, but unmistakable to anyone trained to read the absence between data points. For ships in the Pacific, it meant uncertainty replaced authority. Commanders slowed movements further, unwilling to maneuver blind. Aircraft maintained altitude but altered patterns, widening gaps instead of closing them. No one wanted to be the first to misinterpret a ghost. At 5:16 p.m., communication discipline tightened. Radios went quiet unless necessary. Orders became shorter, more conditional. If confirmed, if visual, if clear. The Pacific had entered a holding pattern without being told to. At 5:21 p.m., surveillance coverage no longer overlapped cleanly. Areas that were once triple confirmed were now supported by estimation alone. This was no accident. Zones don't go dark by coincidence. They go dark when pressure exceeds coordination. Somewhere inside the blackout window, movements occurred that were never logged properly. Distances changed. Positions shifted. Assets passed through spaces that would later show no record of transit. No collision happened. No engagement occurred. But the risk had never been higher, because the most dangerous moment in modern warfare is not when weapons fire. It's when systems hesitate and humans are forced to decide whether to trust their instincts or the machines that no longer agree. By 5:25 p.m., everyone involved understood one thing: whatever happened next would not be officially recorded. At 5:20 p.m., the blackout ended. Not gradually, not carefully. It snapped back. Operational feeds refreshed almost simultaneously. Timestamps realigned. Data streams stabilized. The gray zones disappeared from the map. To anyone outside command circles, nothing unusual had occurred. Ships were still where they were expected to be. Aircraft maintained safe separation. Patrol routes appeared consistent with standard operations. On paper, the situation had resolved itself. At 5:22 p.m., internal systems logged a return to normal operating conditions. No incident codes were generated, no alerts escalated. The Pacific was behaving again. But those who had watched the blackout knew something didn't add up. Distances were off by margins that couldn't be explained. Patrol formations were subtly altered. Assets that should have crossed certain coordinates showed no recorded transit. The timeline had holes. At 5:26 p.m., commanders issued brief, carefully worded instructions. Resume standard posture. Do not reference earlier anomalies. Maintain operational continuity. No debrief followed. No written clarification circulated, because documenting uncertainty would have created a different kind of problem. At 5:29 p.m., diplomatic channels cooled, the earlier pressure eased. Messages shifted tone. What had felt like the edge of confrontation softened into something more ambiguous. Officially, there had been no escalation. Unofficially, everyone understood that a boundary had been tested. At 5:33 p.m., systems showed full confidence again. Redundancies aligned, predictive models stabilized. But trust did not fully return, because modern conflict doesn't leave scars on hulls anymore. It leaves gaps in timelines, moments where nothing is logged, where decisions are made without witnesses, where responsibility dissolves into silence. At 4:18 p.m., warships were blocked. At 4:49 p.m., information began to fracture. For 31 minutes, an entire operational zone slipped into darkness. And when the lights came back on, no one asked what moved through that space. No statements were issued, no explanations offered. Because sometimes the safest outcome is pretending nothing happened at all. The Pacific returned to normal. But everyone involved knew one thing. The most important moments of that day were the ones that never officially existed.